Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we are in the middle of fall fishing up here in the Northeast. Water temps are in the low 60s, mid 50s in certain places. Those fish are in full fall feeding mode, but other places of the country, they're even getting closer to winter, or other places, those fish haven't even started their transition yet or are just barely starting. So today we're going to talk about everything I wish someone would have told me about fall bass fishing, everything you need to know about it, how to adjust to these fish and find them, a little bit on bait selection, everything you need to know so you can catch fish all fall long. So stay tuned and let's get right into it. So the first thing that I want to cover about fall bass fishing is probably the biggest misconception of fall bass fishing is that fall bass fishing is easy. It is absolutely not easy whatsoever. Everyone's going to tell you, oh, fall's my favorite time of year. I catch so many fish in the fall. It's amazing fishing. And while fall is amazing fishing, it's a very frustrating time of year to fish compared to some of the other times of year. The biggest difference in pre-spawn, those fish are very predictable. They are in a zone, they're going to one place, and you know they're going to the bank. That's where they want to spawn at eventually, and you can pick those fish off in between. And while those fish are moving, they're a little bit easier to pinpoint as they're moving. In the fall, those fish are moving very quickly, weather changes fast, water temperatures change fast, there's different conditions every day. I was fishing yesterday, it was 45 degrees, raining, 30-mile-per-hour winds, it was nasty outside, it was almost like winter. Today, it's 65 degrees and bright sunshine outside. So those conditions can change those fish really fast, just like they do in the springtime, except in the fall, their only mentality is to find food. They just want to eat as much as they can before winter. So if that bait fish moves and you can't re-find the bait fish, even if you have a really good area or a really good spot, oftentimes those fish will be leaving or they'll go somewhere else solely because the bait fish left. If there's no food in the fall, there's no reason for a bass to stay there, where in the pre-spawn, there might not be food while they're still feeding up. There might not be food there, and they might still stick around just long enough or a little bit longer than they would in the fall because they're not as focused on food as they are on getting to their spawning areas. So we're going to break all that down in today's video, how one is easier than the other, and basically where you want to find these fall bass and things you want to do to make sure you can catch them and target them very easily. You need to set your expectations properly in the fall is one thing that I've learned. And while I've had some amazing days in the fall, I've had 50, 75 bass days in the fall with buddies. We've counted them, caught a ton of fish, had some big bags. Ultimately, there are a lot of days that are going to be very slow, and that doesn't mean you're not going to catch big fish. You're going to catch a lot of big fish in the fall, which is what I really found. You might see guys catching these 25-pound bags of smallmouth or 30-pound bags of largemouth on your local lake and think they're absolutely smashing them out there, and most of the times those guys are only catching 6 fish a day, 7 fish a day. They're not really catching a lot, but they know where those big fish go to feed up so they can survive through the winter, and that's what I'm going to help try break down for you today. So when it comes to finding bass in the fall, the first thing we're going to talk about is food. That's all they're really looking for. Ultimately, you do need to know where these fish were in the summer and where they want to go in the winter. Some places it will be the exact same spot. Some places they might have a transition to a different area that is close by but might not be the same spot. By figuring out where those fish are going to go in the winter and where they're coming from, you can try and target some of these areas where they will stop and feed. And this won't apply to every lake, and we're going to talk about that here in forage in just a second. But ultimately, you want to know where the bait fish are going and where the fish are ultimately going and where their paths are going to cross. And that's going to be the key areas that you want to focus on. They will change, they will move, but ultimately the bait fish have a goal and the bass have a goal, and they're going to follow them there throughout the fall. Ultimately, the bait fish, for the most part, lived deep all summer, and so did the bass, and that's where the bait fish want to end up come fall. But if that was the case where they stayed there all year round, the bass would never make a movement because the food would be there as well. What happens is the bait fish want to go get oxygenated, cooler water. As they've dealt with those higher temperatures all summer long, you'll have some colder influx of water up in some creeks as you get those cold rains, or when you have those colder nights and that surface temp starts to drop a little bit, the colder water is actually going to start to come on the bank. And when that happens, the bait fish will move shallow. The bass know fall and winter are coming. They need to feed up. They'll follow them shallow as well. So that's why you see a lot of shallow fishing happen throughout the fall. But it doesn't always have to be shallow. There can be a lot of mid-depth places as well, points that these fish will stop on. Your main thing you need to know is what is the main type of forage in your body of water. So that scenario is if you have shad, sometimes like alewives or blueback herring will do that as well. Mostly those migratory bait fish, they live in giant schools. They love that cooler water, oxygenated water. That's what those bait fish really like. So when those fish move and they follow them shallow and then go back deep and they're chasing bait fish up a creek and back, that's really only if those fish feed heavily on shad and alewive and blueback herring. And while that's the preferred forage of most of these bass, especially in the fall, because they live in giant schools, they can chase these fish and get a lot of food quickly. There are a couple other types of forage and how those fish will move based on those. The first one being crawfish. Some lakes don't have shad, and that's completely okay. So if you have a lake that has mainly crawfish or a lot of crawfish eating fish, smallmouth specifically, but some places largemouth do it too, what will happen is those fish will look to get on rocky points, or they'll look to get on some rocky banks, riprap, anything like that. They'll run those types of areas where those crawfish are going to kind of hang out right before they go and hibernate. So the crawfish will actually hibernate in the mud and ground up on the bank and underneath the soil. So that kind of area, wherever those crawfish can transition their way out and end up hibernating, that's the same places those bass are going to wait for them too. So you'll be looking for different types of structure, some rocky points and rocky banks if you have crawfish eating fish. If you have perch eating fish, we have that a ton in the Northeast here. What will happen is the grass will start to die off that those fish lived around all summer long, and there'll only be a few remaining patches of living grass. All the bait fish and other like little insects and stuff will be drawn to that area, and those fish will gang up there too. So the perch will go to this living grass to try and spend their winter there and be able to eat insects all winter long and survive. The bass know that they're there too, and they'll run those last remaining portions of grass, outside edges, stuff like that. Lastly, bluegill is a key forage in the fall. Whether you have ponds or you're fishing on a lake or something like that, bluegill almost always live shallow all the time. They love to be shallow. They love to get up there in that sunny, warm water. They're fine with that. They don't need that cool, oxygenated water most of the time like shad do. So what will happen is you'll have shallow fish that stay shallow much longer on bluegill fisheries, and then the bluegill will actually go deep first. So they'll end up going deeper and start feeding on those insects on some offshore stuff, and then the bass will follow with them. So that you might not ever have deep fish in the summertime there, but those fish will go deeper over time because they'll be chasing those bluegills back out of the creeks as they make their way deep. So oftentimes throughout the fall, you will see a transition of fish from deep up shallow. They'll feed aggressively for a few weeks, a month, whatever. Then they'll make their way back out deep again. That's the hardest part of fall, is keeping a track on them. But ultimately, knowing your forage is the key. You have to know what type of forage these fish are feeding on to be able to make that proper track and see where those fish are going to go. If they're blueback herring, those fish can suspend. If they're shad, they might chase them back in a creek. That's the biggest key to fall fishing and being able to find these fish as you go throughout the season. And lastly, let's touch briefly on some bait selection here. I'm not going to go too in depth on this because fall, like I said, with the amount of forage that those fish can feed on, how different it can be from bodies of water, you could pretty much use anything you want in the fall. It will pretty much all work. It just depends on what your fish like to eat. So we'll touch a little bit on it, and if you'd like to see a video on more fall bait selections, I'll put it at the end of this one, or if you want to see an even more in-depth one, leave a comment down below and I can make a video on it. Realistically, a lot of your reaction baits is going to be what I use the most, just because these fish are constantly moving. They're going to be always on the move looking for more bait. They want to actively chase bait. They want to get food in their mouth, and you need to cover water to find these fish. So a lot of my stuff that I'm going to throw are like swim baits. I'll throw a lot of swim baits in the fall if those fish are feeding. Alabama rigs is another one. Just anything in that bait fish profile. Another one that I really like to throw is other types of crankbaits. I'll throw all different types of crankbaits, lipless crankbaits or lipped crankbaits. It comes down to your color selection on this one. And no matter what type of forage you have, I will throw a crankbait of some type. So if you have shad, I'll be throwing that type. If you have dirtier water, I'll throw like a chartreuse oftentimes. A couple other colors that I really like to throw. If you have bluegill, I'll throw a bluegill crankbait this time of year. If you have crawfish, you can throw a crawfish crankbait this time of year. Ultimately, there will be a crankbait that mimics the forage that those fish really like to feed on. And you could find something, whether it's lipped, deep diving, shallow diving, does not matter. There will be a crankbait that fits the type of forage and the type of water that you're fishing. So those are ones that I fish oftentimes this time of year. And then the last thing that I really like to fish, not one that I throw as much. This is going to be a backup for me. I don't like to bring it out over some of the reaction baits like spinner baits, chatter baits, any type of moving swim baits, the crankbaits. I will throw like Ned rigs or jigs depending on what these fish are feeding on. Like I said, today we have bright sunny skies, 65-degree air temperature. I would absolutely be throwing a little Ned rig or a jig out there today over a crankbait. It's just not a very good conditions for crankbait fishing or something like that. And ultimately, those fish got their feeding on yesterday when that wind was blowing and you have the cooler weather. That's when those fish are going to feed. And then the tougher days are going to be those bright, slick, calm days, just like in the springtime. Those fish really don't want to eat. You might have a hard time getting them to actually bite a crankbait or a spinnerbait or something like that just because the water's so slick and they can get a really good look at those baits. A lot of times you need that wind to be able to get them to bite that stuff. So that's when the finesse baits will come out. Really, I don't like to do that though because ultimately you need to cover water to find these fish. So unless I absolutely know where those fish are living this time of year and I have them dialed in and I've been catching them on a crankbait and all of a sudden they stop biting, that's when I'll throw a Ned rig or a football jig or something like that. But ultimately, I prefer to go with reaction baits this time of year. Cover water. You might not catch a ton of fish, but you're going to be targeting bigger fish, and you'll be able to cover enough water to find where those fish went, throwing those reaction baits. It's a lot more fun fishing that way, and this is the one time of year that you really can fish those baits and get away with it. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's video talking about some fall fishing tips and help you catch more fish all fall long. If you want to see another video with some extra baits you should be throwing, check this one out right here. If you enjoyed today's video, leave a like down below and make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any more of my fishing videos coming up. Thanks for watching.